This is a presentation of some purely descriptive preliminary findings from my extensive survey into the character traits of language learners, with a focus today on whether or not normal learners can learn sustainable foreign learning habits from polyglots. Let me start by defining some of my terms. I use the word multilingual to refer to people who grow up speaking 2, 3, or more languages. That is, they acquire them from the environment in which they grow up in, and are to be contrasted with polyglots, who are people who speak many languages because they have studied them consciously, learned them later on in life. Becoming a polyglot is a process that I refer to as polyglottery. You start by finding language learning fun and interesting, and you get more interested in it, and you want to get better at it and spend more time and learn more languages, and you basically become very enthusiastic about the process, and you end up becoming a polyglot and end up joining the polyglot community, which is a very real entity that has emerged in the internet age, starting about 15 years ago, forming in forums, making YouTube videos, and now for the past 6 years, meeting as the Polyglot Conference, International Polyglot Conference, with 500 or 600 attendees each year. So this is a very real linguistic phenomenon that seems like it would deserve some study in and of itself. Thus far, it hasn't gotten any research from scholarly applied linguists, which seems a bit strange, because even if this isn't interesting in and of itself, certainly polyglots have a lot to teach normal learners. Normal learners are people whom I define as people who are not excited and interested in learning foreign languages, who find it a chore, a burden, but a task that they must sometimes do. And applied linguists do look into what so-called good learners can teach other learners, and polyglots are definitely very good learners, so it would seem like one would want to study them to learn something about sustainable foreign language learning. By this I mean achieving success in the first place and having this success be long-lasting. Unfortunately, many normal learners find that although they study a language for years in school, they might never actually develop any abilities in it, and if they do have abilities in a language, if they don't use them, they lose them. Whereas polyglots study more effectively and have higher retention, particularly hyperpolyglots, people who study lots and lots of languages. And these do get attention, if not from academic linguists, from investigative journalists who write articles like these: The Mystery of People Who Speak Dozens of Languages. What can hyperpolyglots teach the rest of us? This is an article that came out in the New Yorker a couple of months ago. It's a weekly magazine for the intelligentsia in the United States, and it's probably been read by about 10 million people now, may have seen this paragraph. Much of the data on hyperpolyglots is still sketchy, but from a small sample of prodigies who have been tested by neurolinguists, responded to online surveys, or shared their experience in forums, a partial profile has emerged. An extreme language learner has a more than random chance of being a gay, left-handed male on the autism spectrum with an autoimmune disorder such as asthma or allergies. I put it in red because that's my hypothesis A, and I have issues with it. First of all, I think that even if people might have some of those 5 distinct traits the author just mentioned, they're not going to have them all. So this is a sloppy formation that will lead people to think that they do. And then so focusing on these traits, the kind of things that are mentioned there, aren't things that you have any choice about, and they aren't things that have anything to do with language learning. So if they do cause you to end up knowing lots of languages, then you don't deserve any credit for it. It's not an achievement. It's just a function of a combination of traits. And this also means that normal learners can't learn anything useful from polyglots if they're just sort of constructed to do this. So in order to test this hypothesis, I developed my survey, which, as you can see, it takes people about 36 minutes to complete on average, because it's very long and detailed. I only distributed this to members of the polyglot community, attendees of that conference, and I got over 640 responses. You can see they come from all over the world, the blue countries. About a quarter of the people are from the United States, a quarter from Western Europe, a quarter from the rest of Europe, and a quarter from the west of the world. So while it has a global reach, this is definitely a survey of Western civilization, so the answers reflect that. I took my 640 people and I tried to divide them into 3 equal groups according to a number of parameters. Looking at how many languages people say they knew, I tried to get about 200 people in each group of people who knew less than 3 languages, between 4 and 6 languages and over 7 languages. And looking at the question, how many languages have you studied? I put them in groups of people who've studied 4 languages or fewer, people who have studied 5 to 9 languages, and people who have studied more than 10 languages. I used both of these questions because the answers were slightly different, and I thought that was instructive. And just in general, the first one, people who know numbers of languages, can include naturally multilingual people, and also people just have different definitions of what it means to know a language. So I used both. To test for the things in that red phrase, starting with homosexuality. Looking here, all of my the gray bars here reflect the general population in Western society. Currently, only about 1.7% of people will identify as homosexual, but of all 640 who took this survey, 10 times that number did, and even more when we get to people who know or have studied more languages. So there is indeed some correlation with this trait that is mentioned in the hypothesis A, but not with the second one. Left-handedness is about 15% in the general population, and less than that, less than 10% in many of our groupings, and 10% is another figure that's often given out. Even if that's accurate, obviously there's not a very high correlation with left-handedness and polyglottery. Male gender, though, again, there is. In general, Western society is less than half male, but in our survey it's over 70%, in many cases 75, 76% for those who know more languages, so there is some correlation there. Asperger syndrome, in this display it's not showing, it's only 0.5, it's so small it's not showing up here. And in the people who took the survey, though, 6% have it, and more, 9% of people who know or study more languages, so there is some correlation there. But then when we come to allergies, there is not. The general population, about 35% of people have allergies, but people who took this survey, less than 30%, and that's distributed in these fashions. So if I go to hypothesis A and I rephrase it, I would do it like this if I have to keep it at all. I'm going to say the more his polyglottery advances, the more an enthusiastic language learner has a more than random chance of displaying each of the following 3 traits: male gender, homosexuality, and Asperger's. And to add to those 3 traits, some others that I found, fixed traits, such as laterality, birth order, and monolingual background. Laterality refers to preferring your left or your right side, and ambidexterity means using both hands. So polyglots are not left-handed, they're ambidextrous to an unusually high degree compared to the general population, and particularly so people who know and use more languages. And we don't have a word like ambidextrous for no foot dominance, but this is even more pronounced in our group, almost 13% versus 1% in the general public, and it is higher in people who know or study more languages. Birth order. Your random odds of being an oldest child are probably about 20%, but more than 40% of people who took this survey are oldest children, and when we come to those who know or study the most, it's closer to 46%. And coming from a monolingual background, only about 45% of the people in the world do, if it stands to reason. If more than half of the people in the world are naturally multilingual, less than half are monolingual, but people who took our survey are over 75% in general, and it breaks down in different patterns, but it's much more likely to be a polyglot if you come from a monolingual background than a bilingual or trilingual background. Against all these other traits that you don't have any choice over, I like my counter-hypothesis B, which I also wanted to test for, and this is to say that if you may or may not have any of the above traits, but you're also going to demonstrate trainable, learnable habits and traits that are directly related to language study and language learning, like the amount of time you spend studying, how systematically you study, your attitude towards language learning. And I find things like, to start with, OCD, and here I don't mean the full-blown disease that will keep you washing your hands for hours on end until they get bloody, but just a tendency to like to have things be organized and systematic and to get a bit compulsive about things when you become passionate about them. The population as a whole has 2.3% of people are like this, but people who took our survey, over 4.5%, and once again it's highest at this level. People who study more languages seem to be channeling that propensity to be obsessive about their passion here. lengthy formal education, getting a doctoral degree. This is a hard one to pin down. It's different in each country. In Germany, 3.8% of people have doctorates. In other countries, it's less than 2%. So on average, I say about 2.5% of people in contemporary Western society might have doctoral degrees. But people who took our survey are highly educated. Almost 10% have doctoral degrees, and even more so when people know or study more languages. You can be a good student. I switched to a different color here to show I no longer have a general population statistic to compare with it, but I'm just comparing the different groups of people who answered the survey with themselves. A third of people who took it said they had a very high GPA, were good students, but when we look at this, once more, it's the higher groups that have the higher statistics, so people are better students as they overall when they learn more languages. They learn more languages because they want to. In answer to the question, I want to learn as many languages as possible. About half the people who took the survey said this, but particularly those who know more and who study more. Look at this, 68% of people who study more languages do so because they want to learn as many languages as possible. There's no mystery here. It's their goal, it's their aspiration, their passion. And consequently, they spend more time at it. Only 28% of people who took the study spend more than 2 hours a day studying languages, but those who know more and study more spend 45% study more than 2 hours a day. They also study more systematically. A third of the people, only 17% of the people who took the study said they study in a systematic fashion, but those who know more and study more, about a quarter of them do so. So hypothesis B is also borne out. That is to say, polyglots or enthusiastic or extreme language learners, they do display many traits and habits that are matters of personal effort and are directly related to language study. And those who learn more languages display these attributes to greater degrees than those who have not yet learned as many languages. General conclusions I can reach at this stage are that those in the polyglot community do have a higher than random odds of displaying a few fixed traits, such as gender and sexual orientation, that seem utterly unrelated to success in language learning. So there's a field of further study. They also have higher than random odds of displaying other fixed traits that may be related to successful language learning, more obviously so. Birth order, firstborns are treated differently, have different expectation. Flexible laterality stimulates the brain. Asperger's, this is a condition that enables you to focus on things. Monolingual background, again, just my hypothesis is that people who grow up learning lots of languages don't find them fascinating, whereas people who only know one might get more interested in them. However, their success in language learning is not due to these factors alone, if at all, because again, any given polyglot might not have a single one of these traits, but rather demonstrably due to their study habits and attitude towards language learning. So, therefore, normal language learners can learn sustainable, that is successful in the first place, and long-lasting, permanent language learning habits from polyglots in that they can emulate, practice, or train the following traits. Laterality. If you're right-handed, learn to use your left hand. If you're left-handed, learn to use your right hand. This stimulates your brain in a way that polyglots tend to do. Don't develop OCD so that you can't function, but if you have inclination, channel these tendencies and just learn to be more organized and systematic, and you'll be more like a polyglot. Stay in school for longer, get as much education as you can, study harder, have a high GPA, and if you can't attain this, at least know that this means that polyglots, people who learn lots of languages, don't have some mysterious gift. They're just good students overall. Have high aspirations, aim high in order to attain high. Study harder, study more, study longer. Polyglots who achieve a lot study more than 2 hours a day, and study in a systematic fashion. These are all traits. Everything on this slide is something that anybody can train and drill and develop more abilities in, and emulate polyglots who are people who have attained sustainable language learning. That is, they learn effectively in the first place and they retain the language that they learn, which I think is the goal of any language learner.